This video is about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and self-defense. And what the data has to say about the both of them will surprise you. But to understand how one of the most popular martial arts in America came to be viewed as the best martial art for self-defense, we need to go back to 1993. A 175-pound Brazilian man named Royce Gracie walked to an octagon and changed martial arts forever. He submitted 3 opponents in one night, bigger, stronger fighters using a ground fighting style most Americans had never seen. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu exploded. An estimated 6 million people now train it globally. There are 750,000 practitioners in the United States alone. Before we get into what the research actually shows, I went out and asked people a simple question. Have you ever been in a fight before? Like a physical fight?
When I was a kid, yes.
When you was a kid?
Yeah.
It was like in school.
In school?
In college?
College?
Yeah.
College, yes.
In a fight?
Yeah.
Kinda.
Kind of?
Not throwing punch, but receiving it. Drunk people were annoying my friends. Just, kids.
Boys thing, in France, the boys usually fight.
Out of the 8 people I talked to, 4 had experienced some sort of physical altercation, and almost none of them had any real martial arts training. So then I went to my local BJJ gym and asked 3 people the same questions.
No, the closest I got to one fight was I was a bouncer in Newport Beach. Everyone thought I was a waiter, and no one gave me any respect. He stepped up to me, put his hand on my neck, and I was unfazed. Because we know that's not real. Jiu-Jitsu, we know that's not a thing.
I think so. I only got beaten by my parents. Does that count?
Well, she laughed when she said it, and I did too. Her experience, like most of the people I interviewed, points to something interesting. Most violence doesn't look like what we picture when we hear self-defense. We picture a fight, 2 people, matched and ready. And the martial arts world came to believe that one specific type of fighting was the ultimate answer.
Be forewarned, there are no rules, no judges' scores, and no time limit.
The Ultimate Fighting Championship debuts. No weight classes, minimal rules. The question, which martial art is the most effective? Royce Gracie, smaller than every opponent, won 3 fights in one night. He didn't throw knockout punches, he takes them to the ground instead and chokes them out. In those early UFC events, UFC 1 through 30, ground fighting was absolutely dominant. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu has what are called submissions. So if you're being strangled or your limb is about to break, you can just give up. The early years of UFC saw submission rates as high as 75% some years. Even by the year 2000, a little over 25% of all fights were still ending by submission. Ground fighting was the most reliable path to victory. The martial arts world lost its mind. It's been estimated that BJJ interest has gone up over 100% in the past 2 decades, whereas traditional martial arts like karate or taekwondo have experienced slowdowns as large as 60%. Or 66% for Taekwondo. The US martial arts industry was estimated to be worth around $16.8 billion in 2024. BJJ gyms have been opening everywhere. Everyone's rolling on the mats, drilling triangles and arm bars, myself included. In fact, I got my start in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu because of Ronda Rousey's popularity in the UFC. The logic seems bulletproof. Royce Gracie was smaller than every opponent. He dominated using pure technique. BJJ has this massive advantage over traditional martial arts. There's real, full contact practice that makes it feel like actual combat. Unlike styles with light touch sparring, BJJ lets you train at full intensity every single day without getting brain damage. You can actually pressure test your skills against resisting opponents. That's powerful, that's tangible. That's why an estimated 6 million people worldwide now train it today. So makes sense, right? There's just one problem. There's something much bigger going on here. Something that explains why millions of people are training for the wrong kind of violence. To understand what I mean, imagine violence exists on a spectrum. So on one end, we have something completely abstracted from real danger. On the other, we'll say it's 0 abstracted, completely real. So let's start with something most people think is pretty real, the UFC, or professional mixed martial arts. Where would you put that? Most people would say it's pretty close to real violence, right? Something like traditional karate katas, rehearsed forms with no resistance. Those are way over here, maximum abstracted from real world violence. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu might be somewhere about here. More abstracted than say the UFC or MMA, but still more real than a forms only martial art. But then what about street beefs? Backyard fights, no professional oversight, untrained fighters, emotional beef setting. That's gotta be even more real than the UFC, right? So we're gonna put it here. But now watch what happens when we zoom out. When you compare both of them to actual street violence, they're both way closer to the middle than you might think. Let me show you why. The UFC, or professional mixed martial arts, is one opponent, always. Matched by weight and skill, you know who you're fighting, months to prepare. There's referees that will stop fights before it gets serious, doctors, ringside, padded surfaces, no weapons, rules against eye gouging, groin strikes. Both fighters agree to this. Even street beefs, which is amateur backyard fighting, still one-on-one, still consensual, still a fair fight of sorts, usually of similar size. There's friends or a crowd present as informal referees. Sometimes there is a referee, but there's still no weapons. Both fighters are there to fight. That's where it gets really interesting. As the UFC became more successful as entertainment, it moved away from real violence, not closer. Early UFC was chaotic. Different styles, different sizes, almost no rules. It wasn't realistic, but it was more realistic than what came after. Modern, highly regulated, and more abstracted from real-world street violence than it's ever been. And you can see this in the data. Watch what happened to submissions, that the very technique that built the BJJ empire. UFC 31 to 92, which was 1990s to the early 2000s, I mentioned before that around 25% of fights ended by submission. Whereas in 2017, only 11.5% of fights ended by submission. Modern UFC, twice as many knockouts as submission, ground fighting time decreasing year over year. Why? Well, because fighters got better at preventing takedowns. The metagame has evolved. The UFC sparked a global BJJ boom based on ground fighting dominance, but the UFC itself now shows ground fighting working less than it used to, even in a controlled environment maybe optimized for it. And millions of people are still training like it's 1993. So if even professional MMA has been moving and further from reality for 30 years, what does actual violence look like?
According to the FBI and Bureau of Justice Statistics, real violence looks like this.
Statistic 1, the relationship reality. When the relationship between attacker and victim is known, only 22 to 24% of violent encounters are with strangers. That means 77 to 78% of victims knew their attacker, whether acquaintances, family members, partners. So here's my question for you. How much of your martial arts training prepared you for being attacked by someone you know? Or in an environment you didn't even choose. Statistic 2, the weapons reality. 73.7% of murders involve firearms. 27.6% of aggravated assaults involve firearms, knives, or other weapons. So unless you're John Wick, a triangle choke doesn't really work when a gun is involved. Statistic 3, the numbers reality. 48.7% of juvenile crimes involve multiple offenders. 43% of sexual assaults are committed by multiple attackers. And here's what the data shows. When you're outnumbered, only 11% of people defeated multiple attackers. 26% were incapacitated, 22% escaped. The people who survived weren't the ones with the best ground game, the ones who ran. So let me ask you, how much of your ground game helps when someone's friend is kicking you in the head while you're trying to secure an armbar? The UFC selects for technical skill, conditioning, and strategy. Street violence selects for predatory opportunity, the willingness to use weapons, numerical superiority, and surprise. These are not the same thing. But let's look at the central claim made by many BJJ evangelists around the world. The fight will go to the ground. Well, when researchers analyzed real street violence, not sport fighting, they found ground fighting occurs in about 40 to 45% of fights where both people end up actively grappling. About 70 to 75% of fights have at least one person on the ground at some point, but here's a crucial detail that changes everything. Dr. Bakari Akil's analysis of approximately 300 street fights found that 59% of people who go to the ground first lose. In a sport, taking the fight to the ground is a strategy, but in a real encounter, the ground is often a disadvantage, especially when there are environmental hazards. Think concrete, glass. Multiple attackers can kick you, weapons come into play, you need to escape. Here's what's really interesting. You might now be thinking, okay, so since street violence is really dangerous and unpredictable, I should avoid martial arts training because surely that might make me more aggressive, right? More likely to get in trouble. And that's what a lot of people think. It seems logical. But when researchers actually studied this, they found the opposite. A meta-analysis of 12 studies found martial arts training reduced aggression. Martial artists display lower hostility, higher self-control, and higher emotional stability. Getting your butt kicked and training every day humbles you. And when researchers studied whether self-defense training actually works, well, the most effective programs like the EAAA showed a 50% reduction in completed. So training helps. Training is good, but here's the twist. To get that 50% reduction, the EAAA program didn't focus on fighting skill. It focused on enhanced risk detection, recognizing danger from people you know, forceful verbal boundary setting, self-efficacy, confidence that you can resist. The program worked because it trained women to recognize and stop acquaintance violence. The kind we just saw is the most common. Physical techniques were only 30% of the training. The rest, awareness, boundary setting, and escape. We're left with a massive gap. The most marketed training prepares you for a tiny fraction of real violence. The most effective training is expensive, honestly, hard to find, and it doesn't look like fighting at all. So here's the actual story of what happened. In 1993, Royce Gracie won 3 fights in a spectacular televised event. His victories were definitely real. BJJ is a legitimate, highly effective martial art, and it sparked a revolution. BJJ interest is up 104%, a $16.8 billion martial arts industry in the United States alone. There's 6 million people training it globally. We saw one point on the reality spectrum, professional mixed martial arts competition, and thought it represented the other end, actual real-world violence. We optimized an entire industry for one-on-one combat, matched opponents, unarmed encounters, mutual consent, but actual violence is 77% people you know, 27% weapons involved, multiple attackers, no consent, and look, escape is victory. 6 million people training for a version of violence that represents maybe 5 to 10% of actual violent encounters. Hey, look, it's not because they're stupid, and definitely not because BJJ is bad, but because we confuse entertainment value with survival preparation. And here's why that happened. Evolution optimized our brains to fear strangers with weapons in dark alleys. The predator we can see, the fight we can prepare for, that's the threat we feel viscerally. That's what makes for compelling television. That's what makes us say, I need to learn how to fight. Data shows the real danger is your ex-boyfriend, your father, your coworker, your date, people you trust. Situations you don't recognize as dangerous until too late. Violence doesn't look like a fight, and the market responds to what we fear, not what actually threatens us. Martial arts gyms sell us learn to defend yourself because that's what gets people in the door. But what it look like if they sold learn to recognize warning signs in relationships or learn to assertively set boundaries with acquaintances? Doesn't sound as badass, does it? So here's what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to tell you the best way to train for self-defense, because honestly, I don't think anyone can make that claim with the evidence we have. Remember these numbers? Karate enrollment down 61%, Taekwondo down 66%, BJJ up 104%. Those other arts didn't decline because they became less effective. They declined because in 1993, one family figured out how to market martial arts better than anyone else in history. The Gracies convinced an entire generation that ground fighting was the answer to all violence, with one fabricated statistic and the most spectacular product demonstration ever televised. I'm looking at you, ShamWow. Wow. So if you've been thinking about trying a traditional martial art, don't let decades of marketing make that decision for you. The best martial art for you isn't the one that dominates in a cage, it's the one you'll actually show up to train. Thanks for watching this video. If this video gets even one person to try a martial art they were interested in but dismissed because of marketing, well, mission accomplished. Let me know in the comments what you guys think.